Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this year's Antonija Prelec Memorial Lecture. I want to introduce Arthur Grohlman, who has been a good friend of Antonija and the Prelec family, who will tell us about Antonija's contributions to Stony Brook and library science.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and welcome to everyone. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about Antonija, or Toni Prelec. So I was actually the founding chairman of the pharmacology department and came here at the same year that Toni did, and she came as we could call her the founding librarian for the health sciences library. Now, this was in 1974, 1975. She had remarkable advantages. Remember that this was a print era, and she had been the librarian at Princeton for the math and physics department. She was actually trained in both math and physics in Croatia, so she came by that quite naturally. Pellegrino was a remarkable scholar, the first vice president. You would go into his office, you'd find him reading just for pleasure. He'd be reading Latin and Greek, and then he'd switch to English for a modern science one. He certainly was a great scholar, and he appreciated scholarship. And in fact, he had already gone out and filled all the grocery stores. There was a lot of empty buildings. He had actually purchased whole collections of previous journals, which, as we all know, in that era were absolutely essential and hard to come by. So she began on day one with that aspect of it already done. Now, in addition, where we now scrimp for resources, not just in libraries, but also in academic departments, Stony Brook had unlimited resources, basically unlimited state budget. So if you had an idea, there was money for it, and she took proper advantage of it. And then she did what was probably the most important thing. You can imagine the faculty that came because it was on a university campus. It was, like myself, it was interesting to be with a brand new school, and particularly a school of health sciences that imagined itself or saw itself really as a separate university of health sciences. So the library then became very essential. The hospital was not here, so it really focused on sciences awaiting the hospital. Now, what Toni did was to really reach out to the early faculty, and she'd come to your office with a group of books in your field, carefully selected, and say, which of these should we take? She was so good at all these fields, you always took exactly what she brought. She often had seen books that you hadn't seen before, but she made you be part of it. And then she made it on a personal basis, too. She was a gourmet chef, and she would have the library committee and the chairs to her home where she and her husband fine wines, etc., and really made personal friendships with you and was an extraordinarily charming person in herself. Now, what she also made the point, and is why ordinarily as a professor, particularly in this situation, you want to get back to your work, you don't want to waste your time with anything else. We stayed on as chairs of the library, all of us, for at least 10 years. Just it was so much pleasure to work with her. Now, she championed new technology, digital technology, so I think it's quite pertinent to today's lecture if you compare it and realize that in the 80s, and certainly by the 90s, Toni was already thinking about these things, sending people out to the places like UCSF, which were breaking through in journals. I'm sure you'll hear about it today. So the fund was established after her premature death by her family and friends and colleagues. It was one of the easiest funds to build up because everybody really wanted to give to this. And as you've seen, it has sponsored the visits of some very illustrious librarians from around the world. Now, on the library website, you'll see a list of these, but today's Prelec Scholar will be introduced by Jamie Saragosa. Thank you. Jamie?
Thank you, Dr. Grohlman. I just want to take a moment on behalf of the Prelec family to welcome you all here today. Marco and Drozdan Prelec are the sons of Antonija, and they are very involved with the committee. They meet with us via Skype on a regular basis, and they are very pleased with our selection for today's lecture. Unfortunately, they both reside, one out of state, one out of country, and were unable to be here today, but they do wish you all a warm welcome. So today's lecture, it's my honor to introduce the 2017 Antonija Prelec Memorial Visiting Scholar, Dr. Oya Rieger. Dr. Rieger is the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Resources and Preservation Services at Cornell University, as well as the Program Director for arXiv.org. Dr. Rieger holds an MS in Public Administration from the University of Oklahoma, an MS in Information Systems from Columbia University, and a PhD in Human-Computer Interaction from Cornell University. Dr. Rieger's work in librarianship has been truly pioneering. And we don't always equate archives with innovation. However, Dr. Rieger's work develops practices that enhance preservation of scholarship in today's digital age. Currently, arXiv.org provides open access to over 1 million e-prints of articles in various disciplines, from physics to economics. Such forward-thinking librarianship, as Arthur just mentioned, was the mission of Antonija Prelec, and it's our job as the Prelec Committee to make sure that we continue promoting that vision of Antonija's. So while at Stony Brook, Antonija Prelec was a champion of access to quality information for the patrons in the Health Science Center, and this passion is what closely aligns with our lecturer's work. Dr. Rieger has an extensive record of scholarship that includes grants from the Sloan Foundation, the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. She has presented extensively both nationally and internationally, and has published notable works on open access. We are very pleased to have Dr. Rieger with us today at Stony Brook to deliver her lecture, Ensuring the Sustainability of Open Science Collaborations. So on behalf of Stony Brook University Libraries and the Antonija Prelec Memorial Committee, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Oya Rieger.
Good morning. Can you all hear me comfortably? I sometimes move around, but just a bit closer. Okay, as I said, I tend to move, but I'll try to remember. Well, it's a great, great pleasure to be here, and my sincere thanks to Prelec Memorial Lecture Committee. And Jamie, thank you. That was a very, very generous introduction. I said, who is this person? You know, you kind of don't see yourself described that way. Thank you. It was very nice, very flattering. It's really an honor. It's a true honor to be chosen to deliver this lecture. And that as I was preparing, of course, I wanted to learn a little more about Ms. Prelec, and that I read through some of her articles and some wonderful things written about her. And this article, I chose this article to share with you. It was co-written by Antonija in 1992, and it was about journal cancellations. As I was reading this article, it felt to me that it dovetails very well with what I want to talk today with you. Because in this article, basically, he describes the budgetary pressures. And with the limited resources, she's thinking about how to refine, how to excel the library collections. And unfortunately, she's discussing how sometimes libraries need to assess and weed or cancel some journal subscriptions. But if you read about it, it's not about canceling journals. It's not about limited resources. It's about libraries' role in building and maintaining collections that are based on users' needs, scientists' needs, in a collaborative way, and also to make sure that these collections would endure and they will support future users. And although here I am presenting 25 years from the point that this article was written by her, I think my theme is very similar. Basically, I want to discuss with you how we create scientific resources in a very user-centered way with students and faculty and scientists, and our goal being supporting learning, teaching, and research. And always, 25 years ago we have limited resources, now we do and we will. That it's given the amount of knowledge. Actually, I'm hoping that this will be somewhat interactive, so I very much encourage you to raise your hand and make comments and ask questions. So please don't leave me alone here in the podium, just speaking alone for 30 minutes. As I said, I would love to see your hands raised just to ask questions or make comments. So basically, as we all know, science involves the systematic collection and analysis of information. And basically, we are trying to expand our understanding of various phenomena. It could be, it's very interdisciplinary. It could be scientific, it could be more humanistic studies based. And the outcome of science is what we call scientific communication. Sometimes it's narrowly labeled as scientific publishing. Obviously, publishing is a way of communicating, but think about there are many ways of communicating science, including conferences or including informal conversations, especially now with social media. And basically, through scientific communication, we facilitate, we share information, we help the evaluation of our scientific discoveries, disseminate, and a very important component is preserve the outcomes of scientific publication. And again, it's very diverse. It could be books, journals, it could be digital data, it could be images. Here actually I have a picture of a loon. This is from Charles Wolkoff's collection, by the way. We were talking about him yesterday. And it could be audio, it could be video, or it could be numeric data. And I would say up until maybe 20 years ago, when we talked about scientific communication, we talked about, there were three key players. We had, of course, scientists, scholars, we had publishers, and then we had libraries. Libraries were seen as repositories of knowledge, repositories of content created through science. But if you think about what had happened during the last 2 decades, especially with the advanced scientific instruments, different research methods, now we are gathering data from so many through so many techniques, whether it's the human genome or whether it's a sky survey or it's biodiversity, and that we are generating very large quantities of digital data. So in a way, this is how our stacks are starting to look like. It's terabytes and terabytes of data. And eScience, which is a part of my title, is a term that represents what is happening to science, what's happening to research. Basically, it indicates that eScience is generation of large quantities of text, images, audio, video, and it's very interdisciplinary and it's very collaborative. Just to give you a very quick example, this is Sloan Digital Sky Survey. This research study was conducted during 2000-2008, and it involved 25 organizations worldwide. And the goal of the survey was to examine the history and structure of the universe, and they did that by mapping the sky. And as they were gathering data and mapping the sky, they ended up generating 100 terabytes of data. And what's interesting about studies like this one, and it's happening everywhere now, is that almost 100% of the time they are funded by either federal grants or foundations. Like in this case, it's Sloan Foundation. And if you look at it, whether it's an NSF grant, NIH grant, or a Sloan grant, the funds are mainly for research and discovery and publishing. But it's very, very rare that there are funds in these grants for preserving and making available data collected through these eScience initiatives. Therefore, the question that I really want to focus on today is, how do we produce, share, provide access, and archive for future generations when we are so much now embedded in eScience initiatives and creating digital content? Again, going back to my libraries versus the library stacks versus digital stacks images, libraries actually provided infrastructures for us for scientific publishing, right? We had, collections, which are books, serials. We had stacks, reading rooms. We had indexes, policies. And that now we need a similar infrastructure for eScience. We do need networks, computers, software, repositories, mass storage. And the concept of infrastructure is really important, I think, for us because library infrastructures are baseline services. Water lines, roads, bridges, and we often take infrastructures for granted. They exist, they reside to the background. We take them for granted until something happens, until a bridge is not working or until a road needs to be repaired. So we do need to now build an infrastructure for eScience, which means we need to be able to create baseline services so that all these grant-funded projects can take advantage of, and just to make sure that we don't have kind of orphan initiatives left behind. So actually libraries, I know that there are many of you from libraries today. As you know, last, again, 10 years especially, libraries have been expanding their missions to collaborate with scientists and other libraries in creating this infrastructure. And it very much dovetails with libraries' mission, which is creating the scholarly record and making it accessible and usable for current and future generations. This is really the concept of sustainability, the other key word in my presentation title. Basically, sustainability is long-term stewardship. Again, going back to my infrastructure concept and my example of roads, sustainability of roads not only indicates that you need to repair them, you need to preserve them, but you need to enhance them. You can't have the same highway for 25, 30 years. It needs to evolve to meet the needs of the current traffic patterns. And I mentioned to you the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Again, if you go back to that example, the concept of sustainability is that 100 terabytes of data, millions and millions of dollars were spent in collecting that data, analyzing that data, creating code books, writing about that data. What happens to all that information? That is really in the essence of question of sustainability. Now, you are very familiar with this diagram, the long tail diagram. Sloan Digital Sky Survey, as I said, it's 100 terabytes, so it falls somewhere in this area where you have very high amounts of data. But when we say eScience, it's not always terabytes and terabytes of data. Actually, there is significant evidence that even with eScience, there's a very long tail. There are some collections, there's some work that may be less than 1 terabyte, but it's very valuable. So by no means we want to equate eScience only with very, very large data sets that, as I said, the long tail is maybe they have very significant scholarly impact, but they may not have very large quantity in means of storage. So looking at this long tail, today I want to talk with you about one of the programs that I oversee. It's called arXiv. Who knows about arXiv? Just to give a sense of, okay, looks like almost half of you know about arXiv. For those of you who are not familiar, let me just give a very, very quick overview. arXiv.org, it began in 1991, so it's pretty old. It's more than 25 years old. It is an open access repository for preprints, for papers in many fields of physical sciences. It began in physics, but very quickly expanded to mathematics and computer science, quantitative biology, quantitative finance, statistics, and just recently we added electrical engineering and also economics. So it's growing, but as I will explain, it's definitely very controlled, careful expansion. So just to give you a very quick example, what happens is, as a scientist, you write a paper, and that this paper is usually not ready to be published, not ready to be submitted to a publisher, but you want to make your paper, the results of your research, early on available to your colleagues, because you want your colleagues to read this paper and that give you feedback, and you want to sometimes claim priority that you worked on this before some others did, and that you want your paper to be read broadly before it's published. So that's the concept of preference. So you take your paper through a very simple online process, you submit your paper, and then within a day, it appears in arXiv. And that there's an abstract, and as you can see, you could click and you could see a PDF version. And by the way, this is very often work in progress, so you may put version 1, version 2, version 3, and you may put a published version, and you may even put what we call post-print, meaning it's published, but after it's published, based on feedback, you refine the article, and then you publish it again. And then you click, and here's your article for the world. Some of you may ask, what is the difference between PubMed Central and arXiv? The main difference is that PubMed Central, it's a repository for peer-reviewed manuscripts that are ready to be published, and that it's life sciences and biomed, and that the difference is that, as I said, with arXiv, you could be in any stage of your scholarly writing process, that you might be 4 versions away from a peer-reviewed copy, that you are kind of sharing your early findings, whereas with PubMed Central, it is the copy right before it's published. So that's a big difference between them. And of course, they also have different subject areas, this one being more biomed and public sciences. So again, just to repeat, the goal of arXiv is that by making your discoveries, making your assessment and your interpretation early on available, you are disseminating scientific findings, priority, and then feedback. But a very important element of arXiv as a preprint repository is open access, that scholars from all around the world, they can deposit to arXiv free, and then they can have access to arXiv free. And probably one of the most gratifying parts of my jobs is the messages I get from scientists from developing countries and telling us that arXiv makes science available for them. Because as you can imagine, when you're in a library in Bangladesh or Nepal, your library may not have funds to be subscribing to Elsevier or Wiley or so on and so forth, that this is where their science is coming from. Now, one difference between arXiv and PubMed is that PubMed is mainly NIH. It's a very US-centric, although I know there are international collaborations. But here's a diagram that shows where arXiv's use is coming. And if you look at content, meaning submissions, who is submitting to arXiv, it's very similar. Only 28% of arXiv submissions are coming from the US, and the use is coming from the US. But otherwise, look how international it is. Germany, 12%, Switzerland, 7%, United Kingdom, 11%, Spain, 2%. It's a very international database. The content is coming internationally, the use is going out internationally. So this is wonderful, but one question becomes, who sustains arXiv? With PubMed Central, yeah, it's an NIH public mandate, and NIH is putting $4.5 million a year in maintaining PubMed Central. It's a federal service. But with arXiv, it's a global, really, database. It's created by scientists for the scientists. So 15 years ago, Cornell took on the responsibility of sustaining arXiv, but in a very, very collaborative manner. So what I want to go through with you is what it takes to sustain, to manage a system, a service like arXiv. So basically what I would call principles of sustaining archive, and I have 4 principles to provide, just to illustrate what it takes to sustain these eScience initiatives. Before actually I start sharing with you these principles, any questions or comments? Yes, Bruce.
So, I'll try to speak loudly enough. Does archive have any sort of screening process? In other words, are people sometimes who just submit some junk
Yes.
that doesn't belong there? How do you...
Excellent question. It will be one of my principles. So I'll be glad to go over it with you. Yeah. Excellent. I love it. You see, it's just segue to where I am taking this. Yes.
You have the ability to deposit date in archive, and if so, what's your limit? Zero limit?
Yeah. It's very limited. We are starting to, and again, I will expand on that issue. But I'm so happy that I prepared you for the principles section, the questions you are asking me. Yes, Jane.
Do publishers ever give pushback to somebody who has already posted a preprint of their publication on something like
That's an excellent question. So arXiv is 25 years old, and I would say maybe up until 8-10 years ago, some publishers were nervous. But what had happened is, I think we proved 2 things. One was that arXiv created its own niche that it almost is in the life cycle of publishing. Preprints is different than peer-reviewed version. So we don't know of any journals that closed its doors because arXiv stole the business. So I think we have proven that arXiv has a role, but we coexist. And the other thing is, from Cornell's perspective, or my role as program director, I'm very fond of open access, but I do never see arXiv as a tool to turn over the balance of scholarly communication. For me, arXiv is a way to enhance science, to open science, but we don't compete with publishers. That's not an open goal. We have never been an activist. We are more of a service provider. So because of those, I guess, those 2 reasons, we coexist very well, even with Elsevier, that they allow articles to be published on arXiv. That I think it's trust, but it's a very long process that you're seeing years of coexistence. Yes, sir.
Does the appearance on the archive, that moment in the legal patent world, is that now, you will now disclose that, and both in Europe and the different approach in the United States, that is the date of the release? In other words, no one else can patent that information or anything related to it because it is now...
That's an excellent question. Yes, there's a time stamp. Actually, even, is that what you're asking, as we receive articles?
I'm saying legally, and
yes.
patent the material that's in there, including the person that has already filed a patent.
Actually, that's a really good question. First of all, arXiv is it's a database. There's this concept of licensing and date stamps, so there's evidence. But I would assume the answer to your question may vary from country to country, depending on their patenting rules and procedures. But for many scientists, it's almost like you get a legal receipt when you publish it. You say, I published my article, and if you look at actually one of the articles there is usually a timestamp. Even the timestamp depends on what time of the day that you submitted. But I'm afraid answering the question about there are variations among countries, I would imagine, in means of patent or evidence. So, as I said, the principles, and principles will be actually some of your questions, some of the questions that you're asking. arXiv is considered a very successful repository. It has 1.3 million papers. And just to give you a sense of how prevalent it is, last year we conducted a user study. And in 2 weeks, we got 36,000 responses. And my target was 1,000. I said, I have to get 1,000 responses. So we are talking about millions of people and millions of downloads a day. And that if you look at why arXiv is so successful, I think it boils down to the fact that it was created by scientists. arXiv was created in 1991 by a physicist, Paul Ginsburg, and that he early on, especially during the 10 years, he really handcrafted arXiv based on the disciplinary culture and that practices of physics and physical sciences community. And not only that, he ensured as a scientist that arXiv as an information system is, syncing well with the, culture of physical sciences, but also it was a trust issue. arXiv's development also involved so many other scientists. So it was created by scientists for the science that I want to highlight that it's an extremely important issue, having it come through the science. I was just talking with actually Arthur about a system called bioarchive that you may know about it. Bioarchive, it is for biomedicine and life sciences, and that your neighbor, actually, it's by Cold Spring Harbor Lab. I believe it's only an hour away or so. The founder is the director of the press from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, John Inglis, a colleague that I'm very fond of and work very closely with. bioarchive is, I believe, 3 years old, and it includes about 15,000 papers. But even if you look at the name bioarchive, the use of arXiv, it's definitely taking after arXiv, but it's focusing on, as I said, biology and life sciences and kind of a different product areas. I wanted to show this as an example that it's definitely growing, but uptake in biology and life sciences has not been as quick as arXiv. Although when I say quick, I want to emphasize that arXiv is 25 years old. It's a kind of a grandparent at this point. But with bioarchive, as John and I compare notes, we do see definitely some differences in disciplinary practices and scientific publishing patterns that influence. So by all means, arXiv is very successful, but I want to note that the concept of preprint doesn't necessarily work in every discipline. It's very important to understand how it blends with the culture. And the second principle I have here is the user input. I mentioned to you that we conducted a user survey to understand how arXiv is doing and where arXiv should be heading. And one important and interesting example I want to share with you is that in this user survey, we asked the users, we said, do you want us to add annotation and ranking features so that when users read your article, there will be features to write comments and rank your article, to be able to recommend your article, to be able to critique your article online, all included in arXiv. And that the predominant response was very conservative. They said no. They said, if you want to do it, they said, please be careful, make sure that it's curated and there's quality control. And it all boiled down to, as librarians, from a distance, the open science concept is perfect. But when you are in the science world, as a practicing scientist, there are many human factors. It's your reputation, the fairness, the power dynamics, the bias, the civility, especially the civility. There were concerns about the comments not always being written with constructive tone, for example. I wanted to mention this because technology is way ahead of the social sciences in means of understanding science and scientists that, we need to be very careful about implementing science without understanding, or implementing technologies without understanding what the implications are for day-to-day rhythm of science and reputation and careers, academic careers. The second principle I want to mention, and again I will be actually referring to your questions, is arXiv is a moderated scholar communication forum. So let me tell you what happens. So we get 600 papers a day, preprints, right? And we have 4 full-time equivalent staff who screen these articles. And we combine automated methods with human curation. So we have some automated tools. As the papers come, we have automated tools just to make sure that's formatted correctly, the subject category is correct, because we do some text mining-based analysis to know which category it should go to. Because even if it is physics or computer science, there are many sub-disciplines. And as a scientist, you don't want to get a list of 600 papers a day. You just want to get a list of new archive papers that are in your field. So some of the processes are automated, but still, so much of the process is manual. And this process here, so the articles are submitted. There are 150 moderators from all around the world that we channel these papers to for a quick review. It's not peer review, but it's review. They want to make sure that the paper is scientific, academic, it has value, it contributes to science. We actually have text overlap analysis. We want to make sure that they are not plagiarized. So we have a checklist of quality. So when your paper is submitted to arXiv, it's not peer reviewed. Again, I want to emphasize, but it went through a quality control mechanism. And that's maybe what makes arXiv so valuable, that if there are citations missing, if there are figures misnumbered, or there are missing figures, that there's a feedback mechanism. And this is what makes arXiv very valuable, but also this is what makes preprint archives very, in a way, difficult to maintain sometimes. As I was talking with John Inglis from bioRxiv, one example that we talked about was, with arXiv, there aren't that many human consequences to these articles in physical sciences. But in the life sciences and biomedicine, John was, for instance, talking about Zika virus and the preprints that they were receiving, and some of the experimental papers or the results of experimental research that have not gone through peer review yet. And what are the implications of preprints pushing these articles so early on globally? So I just wanted to kind of mention that we need to be very nuanced and careful about assessing the role of preprints. It so much depends on the discipline. Yes, it's working in biomedicine, but it requires a bit more filtering and moderation as it has human consequences. It has more issues related to IRBs, institutional review boards, confidentiality. One case we had in arXiv was, and it doesn't happen very often, there was a facial recognition feature article in the computer science section, and that the illustrations were human faces. So, of course, our moderator immediately tagged that and said, are there privacy issues here? But I want to highlight, it's not all automated. Still, we are talking about eScience, but even eScience involves human creation. Of course, I already mentioned copyright status, privacy, confidentiality issues, and careful expansion, which I indicated by saying that, yes, it works for physical sciences, but we need to be very careful. Last year, we saw the emergence of 12 new preprints, from sports to engineering to social sciences. And one of them is for medicine. This is very new. It's just starting. It's led by a group of scientists from Yale University, and it's for clinical data. And again, you see the word arXiv there, that their goal is to share clinical data in preprint stage before it's ready for peer review and publishing. And they argue that it will increase the transparency of science, speed up dissemination, and also help with provenance of ideas. Again, it's very exciting to see it, but as someone who has been running arXiv for 10 years, I realized that running these preprints require very strong buy-in from scientists and users, and we will see how medRxiv will evolve. Another important principle is transparent governance structures. Now, we are all, I know, most of you, I should say, we are all very fond of open access. We understand the role of open access in lowering the barriers and leveling the field in means of having access. But open access doesn't mean that open access information is free to produce. It's free to use. Archive, you can deposit papers with no charge. You can read without any charge. But it takes me $1.5 million to run Archive. And I have 12 staff. So where is the money coming from, right? And in the case of Archive, we have a collaborative funding model. And that I want to acknowledge with great respect the role of Simons Foundation. Actually, Simons Foundation is a very important key funder of Archive. And then we have contributions coming from 200 member libraries and also other foundations, including Sloan Foundation. But one thing with open access is who is going to pay for it, because it's being open doesn't mean that it doesn't cost you money to create a service. And that's actually one of the problems with predatory journals. With predatory journals, open is great, but somebody has to pay. Who pays? Scientists pay, right, through article processing charges. Engagement of stakeholders. In the case of Archive, we have 2 advisory boards. We have advisory board, one of them is composed of scientists, and the other one is members, especially libraries and funding organizations. Because when you create a collaborative eScience enterprise like Archive, you need to make sure that you give a voice to your stakeholders and that you develop and maintain services that really resonate with their vision and with their values. Moving on, another important integration issue is, and this was a question actually, science, the products of science is so broad. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, you conducted a research study at the end. You had a paper that you presented at a conference, and then you had a paper that you published. But now, look at it from investigation to dissemination. You gather data, you have code, you have preprint, you have slides, you have images, you have audio, video, you have published paper, you have a video cast, you have a social media. So there are so many nodes to your scholarly communication. And that, of course, also reference linking, meaning because so many articles are electronic form now, when you are reading an article, at the end of the article, wouldn't it be great if you click on a reference and that reference takes you to the full version of that article? So it's kind of showing you how we are science is turning into a very sophisticated web. And in the case of Archive, what we are doing, although very cautiously, is allowing users to add slides, images, and data with their articles, so that if there's a paper, they can also submit the underlying data, the research data. But we are doing this very cautiously because it's yet another area, another quality control domain, and also, of course, with the file size, so on and so forth. That, again, I want to highlight that this is a desirable feature, but it's important to be careful about it. And the last principle, the last issue actually within integration within scientific communication ecology is preservation. That you want to make sure that the digital files are stored and that they are maintained in such a way that they will be available for future generations. So thank you for listening to me as I gave you some examples of what it takes to sustain an eScience enterprise like Archive. I must tell you that it was only the tip of the iceberg. There are really some intriguing, very important issues as we try to build and maintain eScience initiatives. So I would love to hear from you questions, comments, or your experience with eScience and sustainability. Thank you very much. Thank you.